When it came to choosing a base for my Primaris Azrael, I wanted something that not only was a little more impressive, but also something that fitted in with the theme of the model mounted to it. Being of the Dark Angels, it made total sense for me to include part of a member of the Fallen to his base. I originally envisioned just including a helmet beneath a rocky outcrop, but quickly decided to employ a near enough full body to the base. A fallen, if you will. To represent this body, I needed some Space Marine armor. The Mark III kit has been one of my go-to sets for a lot of projects, and this one was no exception. Not only are the Space Marine in this set already in several easily reposable pieces, but the style of armor fits into the Fallen being separated from the Imperium and having to use whatever armor they have available. So with the kit selected, I set about removing all the components required to build a Mark III Marine from the kit before cleaning up any mold lines or sprue tabs. To get a feel for how the model will be positioned on the base, I made a bit of a prototype using the removed components and some blue tack as a temporary adhesive. This allowed me to see how well the model could fit onto the 40mm base and also gave me a rough idea of where cuts and trims would need to be made. I found that most of the body could easily fit within one half of the 40mm base, leaving the rest of the base to be built up with a rocky outcrop. My intention was to have Azrael's left foot mounted on the flat surface of the torso, and his right foot on some rocks. This meant that I needed to ensure the position of the torso on the base was correct. If I had used the whole torso, the base height would be much too tall, but luckily for me, the Mark III torso comes in two halves with a flat join. So instead of adding the full torso, I chose to forego the power pack and rear half of the torso, giving the body a partially buried appearance. However, before I glued this component into place, I wanted the dead Fallen to appear that he'd suffered some battle damage before succumbing to his wounds. It was much easier to apply this damage to the components before they were attached to the base, and I used a combination of my saw, my knife, and a pin vise to add various cuts, dents, and bullet holes. Once I was happy with the fit, I could glue the torso into place. By only using half of the torso, I now had the problem of attaching the legs. The full-size waist wouldn't fit underneath the torso and so needed to be cut back. I used my saw to halve the backside of the legs, cutting through the ball joint and down through to the thighs. With the first cut completed, I compared the fit against the torso. It still wasn't quite fitting correctly, so I made a few more trims with the knife and file until I was happy that the waist could fit beneath that front armor plate. However, the legs were still sitting a little too high, and so these also needed to be adjusted. Similar adjustments were then made to the bottoms of the legs, flattening out the back sides of them with a series of cuts and trims. Once I was happy that the legs were sitting flat enough against the base, I then added my battle damage, using the same methods as before. Finally, the legs were glued into place. You'll notice that I had opted to not use the bottom half of the right leg here, but if you wanted more of the body on show, you could easily include this as well. The next few steps saw me follow a similar process to adding the torso and the legs. It involved reducing the size of the components by sawing and clipping before adding battle damage and finally gluing them to the base. I did this with the left arm, shoulder, and the head. I ultimately decided to avoid the right side of the body completely. Instead, I wanted to build up rocks around it to continue the idea that the body was partially buried under rubble. Now, to build up this rubble, I turned to another familiar material, cork floor tiles. They're cheap, easy to work with, and make for excellent rock formations and rubble piles when they're torn apart. I started by ripping out a few larger chunks. These would be arranged in a fractured pattern around the body to help bulk up the right side of the base. I personally use super glue to attach these into place, but regular wood or hobby glue could be used instead. I continued this until I had filled the majority of the empty space and had created a roughly level height to the front of the torso. This would be extremely important when I came to glue Azrael to the base. With the large chunks in place, there were still a number of gaps. These would be filled by ripping up the cork into even smaller chunks. Like before, these small chunks were fixed into place with some super glue, and I ensured that all the gaps around the body were filled in as well. Once all of these gaps had been filled in, I was left with this. The final step of building the base was to use some textured paint. This Vallejo Dark Earth texture has a very fine grit to it, which meant that when I painted it over the cork, it helped to add a little texture. This takes a while to dry fully, so I had to leave the model alone for a few hours before I could paint it. Being quite an intricate base, I decided to keep it separate from the model to make painting much easier. As such, the first step was to prime it. I used a black airbrush primer here, but aerosol or brush-on primers are just as effective. I would, however, recommend using black, just to keep those shadows in those recesses nice and dark. With everything primed, I was able to start with my first layer. I took some Vallejo chocolate brown, but any similar medium brown paint could be used here. I mixed it with a little medium to allow the paint to spread a little easier, something that is quite important when painting a highly textured surface like the rocks here. This mixture was then applied over the entirety of those rocks. I made sure that the paint got deep into the recesses, but didn't worry about getting a perfectly smooth and even coverage. This would simply add to the realism of the rocks. As well as painting the rocks, I then used this paint with a finer tipped brush and painted this into and around the recesses in the armor. To continue that worn and beaten appearance, I wanted the armor to look similarly grubby, and by painting dust and mud into these recesses, I would help to create that appearance. Next, I began to work on the black armor of the Fallen. I started with some black grey, also from Vallejo, but Corvus Black from the Citadel range could have been used too. This was mixed with some medium and applied over the armor. I avoided going into the recesses this time around, focusing my application mainly on the flat areas and keeping that dirty brown visible in those nooks and crannies. I also didn't worry too much about staying neat here either. Not only did I want a grubbier appearance, but the base will be less of a focal point than the model mounted to it. To create some highlights over the armor's surface, I mixed a little pale yellow into my grey, specifically some of AK's pastel yellow, but something like Dawn Yellow would have also worked. This slightly lighter grey mixture was used to pick out a few of the details. Then, by adding a little more pastel yellow into the mix, I was able to use this as an extreme highlight, picking out the most prominent points like the rivets and the corners of the edges. Now at this stage, the armor was looking more grey than it was black. I needed something to tone this back a bit and give me a darker finish. I ultimately decided to use some black Templar contrast paint. This was thinned out a little with some medium before being applied over the armor. The translucent nature of this paint helped to darken down the previous greys, whilst also smoothing out those transitions too. After allowing this to dry, I was left with a much more suitable shade of armor. With the armor finished, I could move on to the rocks. The quickest way of applying highlights to these kinds of highly textured and uneven areas is dry brushing. Dry brushing essentially involves taking a brush, loading it up with some paint, and then wiping the excess away onto a piece of paper. You're left with only a little paint left in your bristles, hence the name dry brush. By lightly applying the brush over the surface, the paint will only accumulate onto the raised edges, giving you the same effect as a highlight, but with a lot less effort. I chose to use beige brown for this step, but again, the exact paint doesn't matter too much, it just needs to be lighter than the base coat. Using a lighter shade of brown than before, this time green ochre, I set about dry brushing once again. This followed the same steps as before, but I opted to use even less pressure in my application and focus mainly on the upper areas. This is to boost the base's level of detail, whilst also giving them a more realistic looking variation of colour. I should note as well that with dry brushing steps, I didn't worry too much about not overspilling onto the armour. The extra browns would only add to that weathered look. Finally, I just needed a wash, and for this I chose Agrak's Earthshade. Its dark brown colour would complement the light browns that I had already applied, whilst also adding a little extra shading. This was applied straight from the pot over all of the rocks. I made sure that I got into all those small nooks and crannies, and once it had been left to dry, I was left with a decent looking rocky outcrop and a Space Marine corpse, ready for Azrael to be mounted to it. Now that both my Azrael and my base had been painted, I needed a way to securely attach them together. Just supergluing the feet to the base and hoping for the best would have worked, well, for a little while. I needed something with much more security, so I turned to the ever-trusty pinning method. Luckily, I already had a length of wire superglued into Azrael's foot for when I was painting him, so I could just use this as an anchor. But before I could do anything, I needed to check the position. I wanted to double check that the model would still fit and to see exactly where the contact points would be. With this done, I drilled a hole into the cork, going right the way through the base. I clipped the wire to a more manageable length and pushed this into the hole. However, I didn't use any glue just yet, as I wanted to swing the leg around to be positioned above the Dead Space Marine's torso. This gave me the exact location of where the foot would be, which meant I could use my knife to scrape away a small patch of the paint from the torso and again from beneath Azrael's foot. By removing the paint here, I created a much better surface for gluing. Gluing paint to paint only makes the bond as strong as the paint is, which isn't very strong at all. So I added a little super glue to this bald patch on the torso and placed the foot into it, holding it in place for a little while to allow it to properly stick. All I needed to do after that was to apply some glue around the rod protruding from the base before clipping away the overhanging wire. And with that, the base and the model were complete. Which left me with this. Creating a base that features a well-known enemy of your army helps to add a little extra narrative flair to your miniatures, as well as helping your characters and leaders to stand out above the rank and file. It is a little extra work and does require some extra materials, but it's worth it for some one-offs. If you enjoyed this basing guide, then please do let me know, and if you have any other ideas for corpse bases, then drop those down in the comments below. And if you haven't already done so, then check out my Azrael conversion guide, which shows you how I built the rest of this model, and I'll include a link above and below to that. So the final thing left to say is a massive thank you to all of my supporters. Whether you support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, your help is what keeps this channel alive and going, and it's what allows me to build these conversions and basing guides for you. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out my description for all of the relevant links. And so until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.